you ever seen a depiction of a Continental soldier from the American Revolution? Chances are if you have, he was probably dressed in a well-designed and aesthetically pleasing uniform boasting the patriotic colors of red, white, and blue. If you've watched just about any movie or form of media depicting the American Revolution, Continentals more often than not seem to wear uniforms consisting of blue coats with red facings, that being the portion of the lining that's folded outwards via coattails, cuffs, and lapels, often alongside white or very close to white undergarments and accessories such as waistcoats, breeches, trousers, and crossbelts for things like bayonets and cartridge boxes. It seems pretty American if you think about it, as those are the colors of the flag, red, white, and blue. But was it actually a uniform that was worn, and if so, is it as prevalent and widespread as it's depicted? June 14, 2025 marks the 250th anniversary of the formation of the United States Army, which was created by the Second Continental Congress less than 2 months after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the first engagement of the war, which occurred on April 19, 1775. With the cause of independence being formally kicked off, men from all 13 colonies jumped on the opportunity to join, leading to assorted regiments and other units being mustered and formed, with many eventually falling under the official umbrella of the Continental Army. Though large portions of the patriotic movement consisted of irregulars and militia units, which were much less regulated and often under or improperly equipped and clothed, Continental troops, which had all the hallmarks of a proper fighting force, also had to deal with very similar problems due to ongoing shortages, budgetary and logistical issues which plagued the government and economy throughout most of the war. Because of this, a hodgepodge of weaponry, supplies, and most notably uniforms were fielded for the first few years, and in some cases throughout the entirety of it, as the Continental Army could only supply so much, leading to many having to make do with whatever they could get their hands on. This naturally led to all sorts of colors, cloth, and clothing ranging from a mix and match of coats, tunics, and frocks, seen in shades ranging from the natural such as brown, green, and tan, to more noticeable such as white and blue, and even some potentially problematic such as purple and red. A full video on red uniforms can actually be found on the channel, link to which you can find at the end. Anyway though, what was clear was that there was no clear uniform. That changed. Sort of, with the general orders issued on the 2nd of October 1779 by General George Washington himself. In it, he essentially laid out the first uniform regulations for the Army, which were pretty straightforward, really only going into colors of coats, facing, lining, and buttons, with a little focus on lace and tape. Obviously, the aforementioned issues couldn't be solved and whisked away with a simple order. It did, in a way, lay out the country's first official uniform, or technically uniforms, granted ones that were very basic. The start to it pretty much said that these guidelines would be enacted by their respective units as soon as the state of the public supplies will permit their being furnished accordingly. Without getting into too much detail as far as lace and buttons go, the main focus was on the colors, which were contingent upon two things. The first was related to infantry units, which divided them up by region, with the second focusing on artillery units and their artificiers, as well as light dragoons. Boiling it down, most soldiers would wear blue-faced coats with white linings, but different color facings, but for the sake of specifics, let's quickly cover each state as they were outlined from north to south. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut were to wear blue-faced with white buttons and lining white. New York and New Jersey was blue-faced with buff, white linings, and buttons. Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia were told to use blue-faced with red, buttons and linings white. And finally, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia was blue-faced with blue, buttonholes edged with narrow white lace or tape, buttons and linings white. So a little bit of a difference among the four regions, but what was the same was the primary color of blue. A short video on that is on the channel as well, but long story short was that indigo was a big crop in the South, leading to blue dyes being cheap and easy to source, which also offset British red. Beyond that, the facings were all different, with arguably the most flashy being red for Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. But why not simply stick with a single color for the facings and lining? Why assign 4 separate ones for the different regions? Well, there's been a few answers floated since then, but generally it comes down to logistics, but mostly because quite a few units from each of those regions were already utilizing uniforms that use those colors in those specific orientations. The regulations just made them official and expanded on it to include others. This could conceivably then help with differentiating forces on the battlefield, while also giving each a level of their own personal identity. Now that seems all pretty reasonable, however the problem was most never quite reached these standards. It's been estimated that roughly 100,000 uniforms would have been needed to properly equip the Army, but only about 10% of that was supplied by Congress, leading many units to continue on making do while also trying to adhere as best as possible. But with all of this, suffice to say, even with the drawbacks and limitations, by the end of the war, the Continental Army was in much better fighting shape and certainly looked the part too. All of this still doesn't answer why are Continental uniforms nowadays often depicted as ones like this, being blue coats with red facing and often white undergarments and accessories. Of course, 4 of the 13 states utilized these as per the standards, while a few others here and there did too. But even still, that's just under 1/3 of the total count. But if we look at lines, those being the total number of raised regiments per state, Pennsylvania and Virginia were in the top 3 as far as fielding the most. Massachusetts was the highest, peaking at 16. So what this means is numerically both regimental and by extension troop-wise, the most prevalent forces were out of the states with the blue and red. Throw in the fact that the earlier years of the war saw fighting mostly in the north, with later years leaning more in the south, and the uniform likely was encountered more frequently. But at the same time, one could argue that all the others could have lessened its significance and the fact that adherence was dependent on available uniforms. However, the reason it's been so popular since the end of the war likely comes down to 2 reasons, one seen directly after its end and another in the years and decades following it. In 1784, the Continental Army was disbanded, with protection duties in most regions falling back to militias, due to a few factors, with the main one being wartime debt and budget constraints, but also the concern that a large standing army could lead to problems politically in peacetime. However, one unit remained, or rather was reformed with the ones that stayed active the latest, becoming the 1st American Regiment, which was organized on June 3rd of that year. Being composed of men from New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania, its duties primarily consisted of constructing forts, protecting surveyors and settlers in the frontier, controlling settlement in new territories, and dealing with Native Americans by way of treaties and/or fighting. The uniform they wore? Ones that were either the same or just like those Pennsylvania regiments were ordered to wear. The blue coats with red facings, that were accompanied by white undergarments and accessories. As the years progressed, the regiment saw a few instances of restructuring and changes, eventually becoming the 3rd Infantry Regiment in 1815, which is important to note, and we'll get back to that in just a moment. But now is the second potential reason. Retellings, paintings, illustrations, and so on appearing throughout the 1800s, which likely peaked, at least during that time, with the 1876 centennial. This in turn perpetuated it into the 20th century, leading to things like mass-produced toys, color films made in the second half of the century, and other depictions, which ultimately led to the bicentennial of the country in 1976, which saw all sorts of Americana and nationalistic fervor on a scale that hadn't been seen, with the flag and its colors being front and center. So naturally, around this time, patriotism and American heritage was at an all-time high, and celebrations, events, and iconography depicting the Revolutionary War greatly impressed upon the image of the quintessential American soldier. Interestingly though, right around this time, one of the most significant and technically official depictions of this red, white, and blue variation came into being via a special ceremonial unit of the United States Army. Company A of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, yes, that same one from just a moment ago, also known as the Commander-in-Chief's Guard, among more standard and modern tasks, participates and performs in a variety of ceremonial duties, events, and activities, all while wearing a variation of this uniform. They are called this and tasked with these duties due not only to their history and connection to the American regiment, but also because of ones to General George Washington's Lifeguards, who were essentially his own personal unit throughout the war. What's funny is that this uniform, though probably chosen in part because of it being recognizable and connected to the American regiment, is actually something of a newer one, as prior to it they wore ones that were by accounts and records much more historically accurate to the ones used by Washington's Lifeguard. So even the Army nowadays is somewhat an accomplice to perpetuating this uniform trope. Today though, there seems to be a bit more emphasis on accuracy, at least when it comes to storytelling and living history, with a great example being reenacting, which in many ways is much larger than it was, and with the accessibility and popularity of social media and the internet, these groups can advertise their events, share history and stories related to the units they portray, and perhaps most obviously, research, share, and showcase how there were way more than just one general red, white, and blue uniform. But it seems the ubiquity of this cultural shorthanded uniform is slowly fading in place of more historically accurate depictions, and though movies and TV shows set during that time period are sparse, more recent examples have seemingly been putting more emphasis on proper portrayals. But hopefully this sort of quick one was interesting and informative. It might have come as a surprise to some, as usually we only do one main video a month due to research and time constraints, but moving forward we'll try and sprinkle a few more longer short topics, those being ones that aren't 3 minutes or less for YouTube shorts but not quite as long as the fully fledged videos. A special thanks to O'Reilly's art for illustrating the 4 different versions of the infantry uniforms as denoted by the 1779 uniform regulations. You can find them on Instagram, link to which can be found in the description. Finally, consider liking and subscribing if you haven't yet done so. If not, all good. Just be sure to check back real soon for more videos right here on Uniform History.